We're almost there. We've gotten to that time that we all love to get to, and that's jumping right into the application, right? After we've done the hard work of actually reading the text, breaking it down, trying to understand what was said, and then building it back up to understand the big ideas and the overall message, now we can start to finally apply it to our life. And what's really important when we talk about that is, remember, the Bible was written at a very different time, in a very different language, in a very different culture as our own. It's their town, right? Jonah was written at a time in their town. Now, I've already suggested to you that Jonah was probably written at a later date, like when the country of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, was in the captivity of the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire had come in and wiped out Judah, the southern Israelite kingdom, and took them off to their nation. And so we had an Israelite nation who no longer had a center of government, no longer had a temple, and they were living under this foreign empire. And they had no idea what the future would hold for them. And they were pretty angry at God because God wasn't fulfilling his promises. They had no kingdom, no land. And that's the audience reading the book of Jonah from the author. Now, we don't know who the actual single author was, but it's probably a contemporary of that time, also living in captivity. They probably knew of the story of Jonah and were using Jonah to apply a message here. That's their town. What would their town have understood? Oh, Jonah is a silly prophet. They would have seen all throughout the text. Just in chapter 4, Jonah did some pretty dumb things, right? Like questioning God and saying, it's better for me to die than for you to forgive Nineveh. But he does all kinds of stupid things throughout the whole book. Matter of fact, as a prophet, the one who's supposed to see God, he's the only one that doesn't see God. The sailors in chapter 1 recognize the storm is from God. What's Jonah doing? Sleeping. Funny thing is, he's sleeping like a prophet sleeps, but he's not getting the message of God there. Who's the only one that understood God's message in chapter 3? It's not Jonah, it was the Ninevites. It's the people who aren't God followers, not Israelites. Jonah was made fun of throughout this whole book, and all the audience of the original text would have been laughing at Jonah. What a ridiculous prophet. He just totally misunderstands God. Okay? Now, why would that message have been important? Did you notice how weirdly the book ended? It just ended with something about some cattle. There was no conclusion whatsoever, because I think that is the conclusion of the book. The author wanted the audience to think, I'm Jonah. Israel was supposed to put themselves in the place of Jonah and realize they're the problem. They have the same problem that Jonah did, that they don't understand God very well. Okay? That's what the text would have meant to the original audience. The next thing we want to do when we apply a text is say, okay, what's different from where they were to where we are? Take it from their town to our town. And then what are the principles underneath that message that we can apply to our life today? And then how does that apply in my different contexts, in my life, in my job, or in my family? Okay. So if the original audience would have heard, we are Jonah, we're in captivity in Babylon because we misunderstood God, the very core of who God was, a gracious and compassionate God, and that's why we're in Babylon. Well, we're not in captivity today in our town. We aren't living under the rule of an oppressive regime like Babylon. We've got freedom. It's actually pretty clear. But what are the principles underneath the message that the author's saying? Well, the first is how we understand God actually can impact our effectiveness as followers of God. Jonah was a bad prophet because he misunderstood God. We can sometimes not live out the gospel message very well because we misunderstand the gospel message, or because we misunderstand God or who he is. We think God doesn't have grace on those bad people or those type of people, or God isn't the God for this group or this political affiliation, right? Misunderstandings of how we see God totally impact our effectiveness. And the other underlying principle of Jonah, how we see God, has consequences. For the Israelites, it was captivity. For Jonah, it was being a horrible prophet and being laughed at and remembered for all of history as being probably one of the worst prophets. Not very good things. Well, having misunderstandings of God can have consequences in our life too. It can bring us pain, it can bring us suffering, it can bring us frustration. And these are the underlying principles that I think apply in their town and in our town, and things that we can apply to today. So, how do those lessons apply in your different contexts? In work, how does how you see God impact your day-to-day tasks? Do you think you could be a more effective employee at work if you understood God better? Do you think there are ways that you see God now that actually impact your calling as disciple makers in that context? What about in your family or with your friends or in your neighborhood? Is there consequences to maybe ways that you misunderstand God? I don't like this part about God, or I'm just going to throw that part out. No, these are hard questions to ask, but they're really important questions to ask. And that's where we can start to apply a message that I think is legitimate. I think God inspired the author of Jonah to write a book about conviction, about how you see God can impact your effectiveness of your calling and can have consequences. I think that's a legitimate message, and that we can apply to our lives and really impact the way that we follow God. What we're going to do next, after taking that application, how do we do this whole thing in a life group context? How do we lead our life group members in reading the text and understanding what it says? See you soon.